Number 1. Every community has an urban legend, the ominous lore surrounding a strange house at the top of the hill, a ghostly covered bridge, or the dark woods at the edge of the city limits. Even the small, secluded farm town I spent the first 18 years of my life in had its own legends. Ours centered around the eccentric Strauss family and their even stranger daughter, Greta. I find myself unique compared to most. This unfortunately is because I am a first-hand witness of what so many generations whispered of behind closed doors, around the campfire, and at night to scare children. On one fateful evening, I found myself in the Strauss family home. I can say with brutal honesty that the horror I experienced on that night led to countless therapy sessions, bottle of little white pills, and a new life in a large city, with the nearest farmhouse at least 100 miles away. I have found it best to begin with the retelling of my story by passing along the original legend the same way it was told to me by my peers. The Strauss family moved to the United States from Germany in the early 1900s and settled on a large plot of land in central Illinois. People aren't sure why they chose to leave Germany, or why they decided to buy 300 acres in the middle of nowhere. We did, however, know a few things about them. They were very wealthy, self-sustaining, and refused to leave the family farm. All of their food was either harvested, fished, or slaughtered. Their children were homeschooled, and the deceased were laid to rest in a family cemetery. Their property was littered with ominous signs written both in German and English, expressing how they very much wished to be left alone. There are more than a couple of rumors from townsfolk witnessing door-to-door salesmen walking onto the property but never leaving it. Rose Lane was the only road that ran along the Strauss's property line. It served as a looking glass for the rest of the community, allowing an opportunity of 10 seconds or so to catch a glimpse of the massive, eerie home. Over the years, the Strauss became more and more reclusive. Months would pass without seeing a single family member. Once in a blue moon, someone would spot one of the Strauss wandering the property or staring at the cars as they sped along Rose Lane. It was like winning the social lottery. The most common sightings were of the mother or father, whom we simply referred to as Mr. and Mrs. Strauss. People would gather around the lucky individual and eagerly interrogate them as to whom they saw, and what odd thing they were seen doing. The most famous Strauss, of course, was Greta. Everyone knew her name thanks to our town's gossipy postman. Greta earned the coveted title as the strangest Strauss due to her morbid choice of clothing and frightening appearance. Greta's sightings were seldom, but always similar in their retelling. She was dressed in black and only black, regardless of the season or time of day. Greta would be draped from head to toe in an ink-colored gown. Even stranger, her head was always hidden beneath a dark veil. No one in town had ever seen her face, not even a glimpse. Many years ago, as the story is told, Greta was working in the stables. Instead of focusing on the task at hand, she began to dance and play about as most children do. In a split second of wavered attention, she startled a young colt and was swiftly kicked in the jaw. To teach her a lesson, the elders of the Strauss family kept Greta from receiving medical attention she so desperately needed, which in turn left her face a mangled mess of broken bones and cartilage. Growing up, my friends and I would scare another with stories of Greta. Whenever a dead animal was found on our property, we say that it was Greta sending a warning. Whenever we were lying in bed at night and heard the floorboards creak, we would whisper that it was Greta lurking in the shadows. Personally, I had never seen Greta, despite the countless trips I made down Rose Lane. I had only heard the stories. As the years passed, the Strauss sightings went from seldom to non-existent. The grass on their land grew long, and the lights inside their home ceased to glow at night. Eventually, we assumed that the Strausses had packed up and moved without notice. The bank couldn't sell the house, claiming a relative in Germany still had ownership of the property and was wiring full legal payments. We simply put the Strauss family farm out of mind until the night we decided to break in. John, Carrie, and myself were 18 at the time. We had just finished high school and would be attending different colleges in the fall. Like most guys our age, we spent the days and nights hanging out, drinking, saving up what little money we could. The summer and our time together were flying by in tandem, nearly at an end, so we decided to make one last memory. The three of us were sitting on John's porch, watching the sun go down and throwing back some beers we had paid Corey's older brother way too much money to buy for us. John ignited the conversation that would change our lives forever. He still hasn't forgiven himself for it. He talked about how he was driving down Rose Lane earlier that morning and thought he had seen someone in the third story window of the Strauss home. Carrie and I told him that he was full of shit. We conversed and shared our theories about what we thought the inside of the house might look like. Carrie suggested that it was full of German treasure and that we could be rich if we broke in. No one would ever know since the Strauss family had been gone for so many years. We smiled greedily at one another. Before we knew what hit us, the alcohol and excitement had us on our feet and walking towards the Strauss farm in the twilight. As we strolled through the woods, we talked about the things we would buy with our soon to be wealth. The sun had finally set as we reached the edge of the property, and it looked as though the monstrous house was glaring down upon us. We stopped for a moment as we finished the last few drops from our cans of liquid courage and debated for a few minutes as to how we should enter. Eventually, we concluded that the door in the back was the best option since it couldn't be seen from the road. The three of us shuffled as quietly as we could down the gravel path and onto the wooden porch. My heart pounded in my chest as we got closer, but my feet continued to move towards the house. We pointed our flashlights at the dirt-stained glass on the back door. Carrie and John silently decided that I was in charge as they prodded me forward. I grabbed the old iron doorknob, turned it, and looked back in disbelief because it was unlocked. As I pulled the creaking door open, a wave of musty air from within the house flew past us with the wine. Looking back at that moment, I wish we would have turned and ran back to John's. Instead, we crept inside the darkness of the Strauss home and shut the door behind us. We stepped into the kitchen and began rummaging through drawers. Apart from a few broken dishes, some dusty utensils, and a couple of ancient appliances, the kitchen was virtually empty. The Strauss home wasn't living up to the horrific reputation we had collectively built over the past few years. It was indeed old, massive, and a bit eerie, but nothing more than what you would expect from any other abandoned home. Everything seemed to be undisturbed. It was as if the Strauss had simply stopped their daily routine, packed up a few belongings, and left the home forever. The three of us searched through the rooms, opening drawers, moving furniture, scouring through cabinets. Our respective alcohol buzzes and hopes of finding treasure began to fade, but as it did, an uncomfortable feeling of dread and paranoia washed over us. We decided this whole idea was a waste of time, and that going back to John's to smoke some weed would be the perfect end to the evening. We backtracked through the home and into the kitchen, towards the back door. Just as we were about to step outside into the freedom of the night, Carrie's voice broke the silence. Guys, look at this. John and I turned and pointed our flashlights back towards Carrie, who had been standing against the kitchen wall. He was running his hands along the edge, and we looked at him curiously and asked him what did he want. Just then he pulled out one of the mounted wooden shelves and it swung open. A new entrance had appeared before us, one that we instantly knew was constructed to be a secret. We adjusted our flashlights and stared at the staircase that descended into the dark depths below. The three of us knew that if there was anything of value left behind, it would be at the bottom of these stairs. Once again, John and Carrie nudged me forward as we crept down the stone staircase. The temperature dropped significantly as we reached the stone floor of the cellar. It was damp, dark, and I could hear the faint sounds of dripping water and scurrying rodents. We started our search, exploring the outer walls, gasping with excitement as our dreams of wealth were back in full swing as our flashlights illuminated glimmering metal and stones. Jewelry, vases, paintings, swords, and coins filled numerous tables, cabinets within the cavernous room. We frantically filled our pockets and rambled on about how we would come back in the morning with our trucks for the rest of the loot. As we made our way to the far corner of the cellar, we noticed something we very much did not expect to see: a large wooden door. As to why it was barred from the outside with a metal rod, we had no idea, but in the moment we didn't care. If the cellar was filled with valuables, then whatever lay beyond the door would have to be even better. John lifted the iron rod and set it on the ground. I pulled the door open and my stomach turned. The air was pungent, with the sour smell of decay. We illuminated the room with our lights, and my brain attempted to comprehend the scene before me. Mutilated animal remains were scattered across the floor. A pile of old newspaper and rags formed a wadded nest in the corner. Against the far wall, a mattress covered in torn and stained sheets that were covering a large lump. I looked to my friends as I covered my mouth and nose with my shirt, turning my back into the room. I said something about leaving just before I saw the horror in Carrie's eyes as he pointed behind me. I jolted back and pointed my flashlight towards the bed. The lump beneath the torn sheets on the bed sat up and turned towards us. Initially, my body refused to move. The figure rose from the bed with awkward, twitching movements. I heard its bones creak and wet skin smack against the stone floor. After what seemed like an eternity, I was able to move again. I stumbled backwards, falling into John and Carrie, and we ran to the stairs like animals, thrashing about, knocking over everything in our path. John was the first to reach the base, and I was a few feet behind him. Carrie had fallen behind. John and I raced up the stairs towards the hidden entrance. I grabbed his shirt tails and yelled that we couldn't leave Carrie behind. We heard his panicked voice. He was close. We turned our flashlights downward, and you could see Carrie at the base of the stairs, and for a brief moment I felt relief. My moment of content was ripped from me as I witnessed the figure appear behind Carrie. Its skeletal hand sunk its sharp fingers into his face and screamed. The beam of our flashlights highlighted the horrific scene like a spotlight on stage. Greta's mangled, decomposing face stared at me between the torn shreds of her dark veil. Her dislocated jaw hung by a few strands of flesh. Her nose and eye sockets were crushed, and her head was crooked to the side, like as if her neck had been broken. Even with her deformities, Greta seemed to smile at me as she pulled my screaming friend into the dark abyss of the cellar and tore into his flesh. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, search parties, and devastated parents. The Strauss property was turned into a crime scene and ripped apart. The police discovered the hidden cellar John and I had described. They found evidence of torture and human neglect in that barred room. The only problem, however, was the lack of bodies. Carrie was never seen again, and the only evidence found was his flashlight and the remains of his clothing. They had been ripped into 100 pieces. I have a theory that Greta had always been a monster, and over time she became uncontrollable. The Strauss attempted to do what they could with her before abandoning their home. Eventually, they resorted to locking her away in a makeshift dungeon to rot. But that's the problem with the worst kind of monsters. One very important thing the Strauss family neglected to consider is that some creatures, the ones that urban legends are written about, just refuse to die. Number 2. Everything started off poorly when I first visited the neighbor's house. I was young, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. What happened isn't my fault, I swear. Just read through the post and see for yourself. I'm not at fault. It was something else entirely, something sinister. It all started as a prank. My friend and I just wanted to play Ding Dong Ditch and nothing else. We didn't mean any harm. I'm sorry I'm freaking out here, okay? I'll start from the beginning. I'll try to leave as clear and concise of a message as I can. Just let me tell you, if you're faint of heart, then stop reading now. It all began 9 years ago. My name is Kyle, and my summer break had just begun. My friends Aaron, Michael, and Diego and I had just finished the 6th grade, and we were pumped up to go to Michael's place and check out his new jet-powered hot tub. The rest of us live in a relatively poor side of town, so when our rich Fred had something so luxurious installed in his backyard, we were absolutely going to take advantage of that. Having packed my bathing suit in my backpack, I was ready to hop in immediately, but my friends had forgotten to pack theirs, so it was just me and Mike at first. He lived somewhat far of a distance away from the school, so by the time we walked there, the others should have arrived at the same time by car. But they were running late and we were bored. Hey, is someone moving in down the street? I asked Michael, gesturing to a big, almost abandoned looking house. Yeah, Mike replied. His name is Mr. Sarko. He's a sculptor. I had wondered why, out of all the big fancy houses here, that one was the only one to have two strange gargoyles lined up on the lawn. But of course, that thought disappeared quickly. All I had in my mind was how I could keep myself entertained. You want to go mess with them? I asked. I think I remember having an almost euphoric tone in my voice when I suggested this. Michael was down for it. What does it matter? I thought. Just a harmless prank. When we reached the front lawn, I almost became mesmerized by the two squatting gargoyles that protected his home. Looking at them from Michael's house, they just seemed like random piles of stone, but up close, the detail was incredible. Every inch of the sculpture had different runes inscribed into it. Every nook and cranny had meticulous detail to an almost incapable level of skill. They weren't as big as I would have hoped, though. Looking up close at the little details, I hardly noticed, at first, that the size of the gargoyle wasn't all too big. It was only accentuated by the size of its pedestal. Of course, I was expecting some hulking, evil, muscular gargoyle like in the cartoons, but this one was little, almost the size of myself at the time. It's crazy, right? This guy has to be a genius, Michael said behind me. I couldn't find room to disagree. I even began to feel a little bad knowing I was going to trick this guy. But then I thought, this man is probably going to end up all creepy and old like Dracula, right? He has the gargoyles and the scary house. He's got to be some kind of creep. So I proposed the idea to Mike. We leave him a little sticky message on one of his gargoyles for when he opens the door. So we go back to Mike's place, find a sticky note and a Sharpie, and we write, I can see you, in all capital letters. The neon orange sticky note was in the perfect spot for him to see when he opened the doors, but he needed to actually walk up to it to see what it says. That was my first mistake. I rang his doorbell, and Mike and I booked it to the other side of the house, just out of sight, but still close enough to peek a glance at his reaction to reading the note. Needless to say, when he opened the door and walked out towards the gargoyle, I was incredibly surprised to see a younger man, probably in his mid 30s. He wore a collared shirt and dress pants, and had big bulky glasses. He was a nerd. I hate that I was like this before. Looking back on it, I want to beat up the child me. But back then, I really didn't like nerds. They were smelly and ugly and always played the victim card. They make people like me look like the stereotypical awful bully character. And this guy looked like he was no exception, so I wanted to make the prank even more interesting. Initially, it was supposed to be like all of the other times. Run up, ring the doorbell, run away from being caught. It's supposed to be simple. Why did I ever get the stupid idea of scaring the man from behind? I snuck up behind him and screamed, some banshee like scream to really get his teeth rattling. But instead of turning around only slightly frightened, the guy exploded with nervousness. He turned so quickly and so recklessly that he lost his footing and fell onto the stone statue, causing it to tilt off its pedestal and land headfirst into the cement ground with a big thump. I could swear that I heard the man whine at the pain of falling so expressively that he even sounded like a little girl at times. After a minute or two of checking himself for broken bones, the man jumped up and began yelling at us, calling us names and threatening to bring us to the police. The thought that clouded my mind at the time was, of course, oh please God no, not the police. But it was hard to feel too worried when the neighbor man had a major nose stinging BO. We apologized to him and told him we would help clean up the mess and do the chores for him as a way to make it up. You, he pointed to Mike, you just live down the street, don't you? How would your parents feel if I told them you were harassing your neighbors? At that mention of being told on, Michael keeled over like a dog and begged for forgiveness, despite me being the one who messed everything up. I attempted to explain the situation and take blame, but for some odd reason, the man was so focused on having Michael make up for it instead of me. So now, instead of having a free summer, Mike had to help the new neighbor move in, as well as do a few household chores for him until he's able to repair all the damage done to his stuff. At first, I wanted to retaliate and ask, what damage? But as I looked at the gargoyle, I noticed that side of the head had cracked from the fall. Some weak rock that was. Needless to say, our day ended short. No one saw the new hot tub, and Michael was progressively getting more and more distant from me. I didn't blame him. The only reason I got off scot-free was because I lived too far away from the neighborhood house. It was unfair to say the least, so I understood why Mike didn't want to talk to me anymore. But then he didn't talk to anyone anymore. No one had heard from him. Not Aaron, not Diego. Even his parents were worried because he disappeared for a few days. Of course, they didn't know about the neighbor man. Mike did all that work so that they wouldn't find out. But to disappear entirely left a bad taste in my mouth. I went to the neighbor's house and asked him about Mike, but he wasn't there. And neither were the gargoyles. They were just gone. I brought this info to the police, and I was surprised to see the other neighbors also accounted seeing Mike spending time at the gargoyle place. It was 3 weeks before they found the neighbor man. After multiple visits and multiple questioning, the police were finally able to get him to confess. They threatened to move his gargoyles to another location as possible evidence. The neighbor man didn't like that. He confessed to taking Michael and throwing him in the river with a cement block tied to his ankle, drowning him. But even after confessing, no body was found. After sending him to prison, the police moved the gargoyles to a secure location. It didn't take them long until they realized what was actually going on. They weren't only gargoyles, they were caskets. Mike was found dead, his mouth sewn shut so he couldn't scream. He died of starvation. I swear I never knew this would happen. I never meant to see him end up murdered. But he wasn't the only victim. When I first realized what had happened, it all pieced together like a puzzle. I still feel like vomiting to this very day, knowing what I had done, but it wasn't my fault. The other victim was a little girl, someone who'd gone missing not a few nights before our first visit to the house. The way the neighborhood man over exaggerated his whining to sound almost like a girl, when in reality he was trying to cover up the sound of his first victim whimpering. The gargoyle's head cracked, and I blamed the smell on the man's body odor. I still can't sleep at night. I still remember reading into the details of her death. She didn't starve. She died slowly of blood loss due to a blow to the head, the same spot where the gargoyle's head cracked on the impact from the ground. Number 3. I've never subscribed to the idea of the paranormal or any folklore stories of the supposed mysterious creatures that lurk around in the night. I honestly still don't know whether I do or don't believe, but I certainly don't have an explanation for what I saw on the night of August 19th, 2007. I've never encountered anything like this before or since that night, and I've only ever told this story to my wife, who I didn't know yet at the time. I'm sharing this story in dedication of a man who saved my life that night. I had just turned 20 years old 2 months prior and had planned my first real vacation for myself as an adult. My best friend Harry and I had our sights set on the Smoky Mountains, which, for those of you who don't know, is a mountain range inside the Appalachian Mountains on the eastern side of the United States. It's a home to a wide range of popular destinations and an outdoor lover's dreams, with varying activities to enjoy such as trail, whitewater rafting, fishing, and mountain climbing, all of which we planned on doing. Harry and I had come to be somewhat of outdoorsmen over the past year, tackling more of our local trails and hiking destinations, and we were looking to challenge ourselves with something new and a bit more involved. We've been planning this trip since November of the previous year and had even gone so far as to purchase plane tickets, hotel reservations, and car rental a month in advance. We already owned most of the gear that was needed, so there would be little additional cost other than food, water, and a few other items once we were there. Well, about a week before we were slated to leave, Harry called me and told me he wasn't going to be able to go. His girlfriend, who would later become his wife, was 7 months pregnant at the time and having a lot of medical issues that required constant doctor visits. Naturally, he was worried about her and he didn't want to leave in the fears that more complications might arise while we were gone. The trip was going to be 5 days, and I agreed that she shouldn't be left alone in her condition. I was disappointed, but I also understood that family has to come first. The thing is, I was stuck at this point. I definitely didn't want to go alone, since the whole trip was planned around Harry and I spending time together. But we had already purchased tickets and put down deposits, most of which were non refundable. Call me a cheapskate, but the thought of all that hard earned money we had put into doing this going down the drain made my stomach turn. To my surprise, Harry urged me to go by myself, at one point saying, "Half the money was mine, and I don't want it to go to waste. Consider it an expensive late birthday present for me, and you can just owe me a big one." He laughed. I thought it over for the next couple of days, and the more I thought about it, the more I liked the idea of going by myself. I've always been a loner at heart, so the idea of me being on my own among the beautiful landscape was very appealing. Plus, the starter trails we had picked out weren't dangerous and were actually some of the more popular trails that were available, so it's not like I'd be totally alone. With that in mind, I made my decision to go. A few days later, I was disembarking my plane. I hastily grabbed my baggage, picked up my rental car, and headed to check into the hotel, which was about 45 minutes away. On the way there, I was taking in the scenery, and it was certainly incredible. Where I'm from, we have mountains too, but they aren't as lush and inviting as these were. I arrived at my hotel at sunset and promptly checked in. I asked the guy behind the counter where I can get some supplies, and he told me about a general store a couple minutes down the road that would have anything I needed. Thanked him and headed that way. I didn't buy much in preparation for my first day. I just grabbed some granola bars, some sandwich items, a few bottles of water, and a canister of bear mace. The mountains are native to black bears, among other predators, and I wanted to be as prepared as I could. I also had a 6-inch knife that I brought in my checked bag, along with a pocket knife just in case. I headed back to my hotel and turned in early for the night. I woke up right after sunrise, feeling excited and ready to hit the trail. I drove about 15 minutes to where my first trail began, and only brought the map I had printed off from my home computer, my phone, and my pack. It was about a 5-mile round trip. It took me around an hour and a half to complete. I was in awe of the scenery, constantly stopping and taking in the sights, especially when the trees would break and reveal miles of green mountain. I wish I was a better writer so I could describe how it looked. All I had to go on previously were the Google images I had surveyed numerous times. Even those couldn't convey just how breathtaking it was. I know how cliche it is to say that, but there was just something about it that moved me. Interestingly enough, I didn't come across any hikers, which I thought was a bit odd. I mean, I didn't think I was going to see a lot of people, but I suppose I expected to see one or two. Not that I'm complaining, like I said, I'm a loner at heart. Once I made it back to the car, I headed for the next trail. This one was going to take me the rest of the day to complete, and I was eager to see what it had to offer. I arrived just as a fellow hiker was coming off the trail and heading towards their car. It was the only other car there, so I figured I'd be alone on the trail as well. I'd never been the type of person to initiate conversation with a stranger without a reason, but I guess my good mood got the better of me. I waved and he returned the wave with a smile. "How is it up there?" I asked, pointing towards the trailhead. He took a sip of water and shook his head with a grin. "It's unreal. Weather couldn't be any better either," he replied. I situated my pack on my back and I asked if this was his first time taking the trail. He said it wasn't. He had frequently used this trail over the past decade or so. "Just make sure you stay on the main trail," he warned. "There's some offshoots that will take you to some pretty remarkable areas, but I would advise staying on the main path since it's your first time. Those smaller trails can get you lost if you don't know what you're doing." I held up my map and jokingly said, "Hopefully she'll take care of me," and he grinned. "Yeah, well, most of those smaller trails aren't marked on the map. Just be careful." I said I would. I thanked him. We waved goodbye and I set out on the trail. I stopped after a couple hours to eat lunch at a small rest area with some tables and benches scattered around a clearing. I sat alone eating my sandwich, zoning out as I chewed away. I had been off in my head for a few minutes when my brain told me something was off. I lifted my head from looking down at my sandwich and looked around to figure out what my brain was trying to tell me. But it wasn't something it wanted me to see. It was something it wanted me to hear, or in this case, not hear, as I couldn't hear anything at all. All day I had been hearing the sounds of the forest and wildlife, birds chirping, squirrels running, wind blowing the trees and leaves back and forward, but right now it was completely and utterly silent. All I could hear was the sound of me breathing. For the first time that day I was unsettled. It's some primal part of my brain that was triggering like a red flag, not telling me that I was necessarily in danger, but just something wasn't right. I quickly finished my sandwich and set back out on the trail. The further I got from the rest of the area, the more things seemed to go back to normal. All the familiar forest sounds returned, and I shook off the incident as me just overanalyzing and making something out of nothing. I arrived at one of the noted scenic locations on the trail. There's a river so clear you could see right to the little stones that lay beneath. For many, this may not be a sight to behold, but where I'm from, all the rivers and lakes are made up of murky brown water, which is very unappealing. The river cascaded over a cliff, making a waterfall that landed in a small valley about 50 feet below where I was standing. This also marks the first time I had seen a waterfall in person as well. Well, a real waterfall at least, like the ones you see in movies and on cell phones, desktop wallpapers. I made a mental note to get a picture of it when I headed back to the car. For the walk out, I was keeping my phone off to conserve the battery and had intended on turning it on for my walk back to get some pictures when the sun was setting. Over the next couple hours, I continued taking in the sights and sometimes zoning out as I had a tendency to do. I've always had a habit of going away inside my head when I walk a long distance, or when I'm doing something mundane. At one point, though, I had zoned out longer than I should have, and when I snapped to, I realized I wasn't on the main trail anymore. I knew this because the main trail, up to that point, had been carved out of the dirt from decades of foot traffic and was generally about 6 feet wide. This trail was about double the width of one of my feet, and the surrounding trees and brush were closing in on me, making me feel somewhat claustrophobic. I sighed, knowing this was going to set me back and hoping I hadn't gone too far off track. I turned around and began walking back to the main trail. I walked for about 30 minutes, and when I hadn't reached the main trail yet, I stopped and pulled out my map. I knew which landmark I had just passed and which one I hadn't yet reached, and I figured I have gotten separated from the trail somewhere between those 2 points. The problem is, there was no landmarks that I could make out around me that I could see on the map. I continued walking for another 10 to 15 minutes, and I still couldn't make anything out. I was getting a little worried at this point, but I knew I had been on this trail the whole time. So logically, if I kept following this, it would have to lead me back to where I got separated, right? I felt like I was going in circles, as the scenery around me wasn't changing at all. It seemed like I was passing the same trees and rocks over and over again. I pulled out my phone, but of course I had no service. Then it happened again, almost like a switch was flipped, and all the sounds just ceased to exist. Complete silence. I stopped and turned my ears in, listening for even the slightest sound, but I heard nothing. Just my breathing again, which was getting heavier as I became more frightened. I began moving and quickened my step, just wanting to get away from the silence like I had had before. But this time it followed me, like a haunting spirit. I swear I walked for what seemed like an hour, and by that time I was almost running. Suddenly I heard a loud snap, like a thick branch being broken over someone's knee. Having heard nothing but total silence for the past, I don't even know how long, this scared the hell out of me, and I was frozen in place like a deer. I diligently scanned the area. The trees and brush were so thick I could only see maybe 20 feet around me in any direction. As the reality of the situation set in, my heart began pounding, and that uneasy feeling fell back over me. My brain was sending me signals again. This time it was telling me I was in danger. The silence was broken again by another loud snap. Now, mind you, this was not the sound a small branch makes when someone steps on it and it breaks. This was different. It sounded like something being broken purposely, with intent. I bolted, keeping on the trail and not looking behind me. I've never ran faster. I felt like I was running for my life, even though I didn't even know if anything was in pursuit. I couldn't tell you how long I ran. What I can tell you is that I was still on the same small trail. I never even passed any other trails. It felt like it was never ending, like a dream when you're running down a hallway that never ends. I finally came up on a bend that I hadn't seen before, and I felt slight relief in just seeing something different, giving me hope that at least I wasn't going in circles. Just as I rounded the turn, the silence ended and all the sound returned at once. I stopped to finally catch my breath. I was panting heavily, bent over with my hands on my knees. "Hey, are you okay?" I heard a deep voice calling out to me. I jerked my head up, and my face must have told him I was in distress as he put his hands up as if to signal he wasn't going to hurt me. He was a large man over 6 feet, mid to late 40s, trim beard, short hair, and very muscular. He had a large military style pack on his back. He ran over to me. "Do you need help? Are you hurt?" he asked, looking me over for injuries. I was so out of breath I could barely speak in between inhales and exhales. I pointed behind me and could manage to get out something and chasing me. He darted behind me and made the bend before coming back a few moments later. "There's nothing back there. Was it a bear? Did you see it?" I shook my head and took a seat on the ground and retrieved the last water out of my pack. I drank the entire bottle in 3 or 4 swallows. The man walked closer to me and asked again if I was okay. I nodded, finally catching my breath. Yeah, I somehow got off the main trail and got myself lost, and then I panicked. He put his hands on his hips and looked out into the forest. "It's easy to get lost out of here. What trail were you on?" I got up and handed him my map from my pack and pointed out where I originally was. He scratched his beard. I don't know how the hell you got way over here. You're 7 miles off course. I shook my head in disbelief. How could that be possible? Are you sure? He handed me my map back. Yeah, I know exactly where we are. I can take you back that way. I looked at him and stuttered, slightly embarrassed at the thought of me seeming like a lost child that needs help. Well, I couldn't put you out like that. That would put you off course by 14 miles, wouldn't it? He patted his pack and grinned. That's what this baby's for. He paused for a moment and studied my face as I considered his proposal. He proceeded. Look, I'd rather know you got back safe than to send you back out on these unmarked trails. It's not safe out here for someone who doesn't know what area they're in, and it's going to get dark soon. I knew he was right, and I didn't want to let my pride get me lost again, and possibly for good. Thank you. Honestly, I don't know that I could get back on my own, I said, relieved. He introduced himself as Tom, and I introduced myself when we shook hands. He had a firm handshake, and I noticed a tattoo on his forearm. It was an insignia I immediately recognized. Are you Navy SEAL? I asked. I am. I did 22 years and retired 3 years ago, he said proudly. I have to admit, I immediately felt much safer knowing I was in capable hands. I thanked him for his service, and he smiled as he handed me a bottle of water from his pack. After I rested for a few more minutes and rehydrated, we set back out on the trail. I followed his lead as we walked. He asked me where I was from, among other small talk topics, but we mostly walked in silence. I mulled over the idea of asking him about what I had experienced. I didn't want to seem even more like a frightened child, but also figured if he frequented these parts, he may have something similar happen to him. So, have you ever had anything weird happen out here? I asked hesitantly. He kept face, not turning his head even. Weird? How do you mean? I paused, trying to formulate my next sentence carefully. I don't know, like something you can't explain. He stopped and turned towards me, studying my face. What exactly did you see out there? I met his eyes with mine and said, it wasn't something I saw, it was something I heard. One of his eyebrows arched up and he leaned in, waiting for me to continue. Okay, I know you might think this sounds stupid, but when I was on the trail back there, it was like one moment everything was normal, and the next I couldn't hear anything. It was like all the animals vanished and even the wind stopped blowing. It was completely still and totally silent. I've never experienced anything like that. His gaze left mine and his face contorted to an expression of discomfort. It was a few moments before he spoke again. Did it just happen one time? I shook my head. It happened twice. I thought I could detect just the slightest twinge of fear in his eyes, or maybe I was just projecting my own fears onto him. He quickly composed himself before saying, we should keep moving. He immediately turned around and began walking again, noticeably faster than before. I'm not sure whether that was him validating my experience or if he was just wanting to get me back as soon as possible. I assumed the latter, since he didn't say anything else, and I didn't ask about it again. As the sun began to set and the sky turned from its beautiful hues of yellow and orange to a more sobering hue of dark red, Tom donned a headlamp he had retrieved from his pack so he could light the trail in front of us. He warned me to watch where I stepped, which I did, making sure I followed in his footsteps as close as possible. We eventually made our way back to the main trail. As much as I didn't want to inconvenience him more than I already had, I was pleading inside my head for him to take me all the way back to my car. I didn't want to go alone. So, is this where we part ways? I asked nervously. He didn't say anything, and he motioned for me to keep following as he proceeded forward. I thought it was strange, but I wasn't in any position to argue, nor did I want to. A few minutes went by before he turned his head slightly and quietly said, something has been following us for the past couple miles. Just keep walking with me. My heart sank to my stomach. Was it a person or a curious animal, perhaps? I moved myself closer to him as he continued walking. Is it an animal? I whispered. He turned his headlamp off without answering me and slowed his pace. I was confused and very unnerved. Then the fear crept back over me as the forest fell silent once more. It was as if all the sound flew away like a flock of startled birds when danger is near. As I was lost in my own thoughts, I ran into what felt like a tree trunk. It was Tom's arm. He had extended it out in front of my chest in the way of a protective parent would in a car accident. I looked up at his face. I can't see very well in the dark, but it It was a particularly dark evening, with no moon in sight, but I could make out his face, and I could see that he was looking at something with more focus than I had ever seen on a person's face. I followed his gaze in front of us, but I couldn't see anything but trees and darkness. He put his hand on my shoulder and slowly pushed me downward as he got down on one knee. His eyes were still set forward, unmoving. He whispered almost so quietly that I couldn't hear him. "Don't move, don't make a sound." My heart was pounding so hard I almost thought I could hear its echo through the silence. Tom slowly reached his hand back into his bag, still not averting his gaze, and came out holding a pistol. I didn't know anything about guns, so I couldn't tell you what it was. I just knew it was a pistol. This terrified me even more. If he was this worried, what could possibly be out there? Then, the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced happened. The silence was broken by someone calling out, "Hello, is anyone there? I hurt my foot and I need some help." My eyes darted back to Tom. He didn't move an inch. I wasn't sure what to do or what was even happening. The voice called out again for help. It was a male voice, probably around my age. There was something wrong with it. He didn't sound in distress, like he should have been. There was no emotion in the voice, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He sounded up the trail a ways, but was also close enough that we could hear him clearly. "Shouldn't we help?" I asked in a hushed voice. Tom's eyes were fixed ahead. Then he said something that shook me to the core. "That's not a person." What did that even mean? How could that not be a person? My mind was racing and I was paralyzed with fear by what he could have meant. The darkness swallowed us as we stayed there silently. I felt like I was awaiting my death. It seemed like we were there for hours, and I did as Tom instructed, not moving or speaking. The voice never called out a third time, and eventually Tom stood up and motioned for me to stand up as well. I looked around us, seeing absolutely nothing. It was still totally silent. "We need to get out of here," Tom said firmly. He began moving forward again, still keeping his pistol in hand. We moved as quickly and as silently as we could. Eventually the silence lifted like a heavy veil. I could tell Tom felt more comfortable, which in turn made me feel slightly better. I was practically attached to his hip for the rest of the way, and we finally made it back to the dirt lot where I had left my car. I had exhaled heavily, as if I had been holding my breath for the past few years. Once we reached my car, I knew I couldn't let Tom leave. "You should come with me, Tom. You can't go back there. I can drop you off tomorrow wherever you need to be," I said as I fumbled for my keys and my pack. He nodded and we offloaded our packs into the car. On the drive back to my hotel, I could tell he was a bit shaken up. It took a few minutes for me to muster up the courage to ask about what had happened, but I had to ask. I was still so confused. "Tom, what did you see back there? What the fuck happened?" I was desperate for answers as to what had taken place, and I knew that he had seen something. There was about a half a minute of silence before he answered. "I don't know what that was." He turned his head away from me and stared out the window. "It wasn't a person. I know what we heard, but that was not a person." It sounded as if he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. He paused to gather his thoughts and then continued. "I clocked something following us back when we were on that trail where I found you about 5 miles into our walk. At first I assumed it was an animal of some kind. I never directly saw it. I was just hoping it wasn't a bear. And after about 15 minutes, I knew it wasn't an animal. Animals lose interest quickly and they don't generally stalk a person like that, especially not two people." He exhaled deeply. Then when everything went quiet, I knew something bad was about to happen. I felt that feeling many times. That's why I turned my headlamp off. I needed to let my eyes adjust to the dark. He paused and again nervously rubbed his knee. He turned his head forward looking out of the windshield and mumbled something I couldn't make out. A few moments later he spoke up, and that's when I saw it, probably 30 meters in front of us. It was pitch black like a shadow and it was just standing there, right in the middle of the path. I couldn't make out many details. It was tall, over 8 feet, had unusually long arms and that almost touched the ground. His voice was slightly shaking at this point. Once it caught me staring, it moved behind a boulder like it was trying to hide. That's when it started calling to us. To be honest, when I heard the voice, I was terrified. I had no idea what to do other than to stay quiet and stay low. What I did know is if it approached us, I was going to put 15 rounds into the goddamn thing. He looked down at his pistol still in his hand. Jesus Christ, man, he said, slouching into the seat. We pulled in the hotel parking lot and made our way up to my room. Tom brought his pack and laid out a sleeping bag on the floor near the door. I noticed he kept the pistol. I wasn't even sure I would be able to sleep, but as the adrenaline had subsided, the physical and mental exhaustion set in and I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of Tom packing his sleeping bag. I sat up in bed and asked if he needed the ride I promised. Like, yeah, I need to get my ass home, he said, half laughing. I got dressed and packed up my things and we headed down to the car. He directed me to where he had left his car the previous day, about a 35-minute drive from the hotel. It was a dirt lot similar to the one I had been parked in the previous day. There were a few cars in the lot, and he pointed me towards a dark gray Challenger. I parked next to it and we both exited the vehicle. He moved his things from my car to his and he cranked it to get the AC going. I walked around the car and after a few moments I managed to say, "Listen, Tom, I still don't really know what happened. Honestly, I don't think I want to know. What I do know is you saved my life." He extended his hand for a handshake, but I went in for a hug, and although he seemed surprised, he hugged me in return. I'll admit I teared up and had to stop myself from crying. I knew that every fiber of my being that I wouldn't have survived if he hadn't been there on the trail that day. "Now, you did good, kid," he said as he patted my back. I never had a father figure growing up, and in that moment, I felt like it was the closest thing I had ever had to one, despite him being a complete stranger. "Hold on a second," he said, climbing into his car and rummaging through his glove box. He came out with the card in hand and held it out to me. "It's an old business card, but the cell number on it's still correct. If you ever need to talk, just give me a call." He smiled and I thanked him as we parted ways. I didn't stay the remaining 4 days. I bought the first plane ticket home I could. I left and never returned. I hate to say it, but I stopped hiking after that, and I'm not really outdoorsy anymore, and I'm never sure I ever will be again. I stayed in contact with Tom. We usually chatted a couple times a month just catching up on life. He actually came to my wedding and even helped me get a stable job, an old buddy of his after I graduated. As time went on and I started a family, our conversations became less frequent, but he always made the effort to check in on me, and I'm eternally grateful for what he did.